Okay, for real though, I want to make it clear that I don't want you to take my words for granted. Do not take my words as expertise like a dumbass. And, if you're wanting to use these concepts of striving play and games as the medium of agency, which we'll get into and all of the stuff like that, if you're wanting to use them beyond just the context of a fun thought experiment, then I implore you to do more research on these topics. These are philosophical concepts, and they are used not only to analyze whether or not a game is good or bad, or are they? Is it really that simple? But also to analyze games from the perspective of how they impact the real world. How the gamification of real things such as weight loss, education, our social lives filtered through social media, and even progressive action on said social media, how implementing game-like mechanics into these aspects of our lives can and has done harm to ourselves. It also gets into ideas of human autonomy and agency and what understanding games in these ways can tell us about those things. As a good starter on these more serious and real-world topics the ideas I'm about to talk about tie into, I have linked a lecture by T. Nguyen himself on these subjects, specifically the gamification of public discourse, in the description. I recommend looking into the sources I cite in the description as it will help you develop a more layered and holistic understanding of this video. I'm bastardizing this man's life work for the sake of my own pretentious pseudo-intellectual video essay. Let's go!
In ordinary practical life, we usually take the means for the sake of the ends. But in games, we can take up an end for the sake of the means. Playing games can be a motivational inversion of ordinary life. Seeing this motivational structure will also help us to understand the essential nature of games. A game tells us to take up a particular goal. It designates abilities for us to use in pursuing that goal. It packages that all up with a set of obstacles, crafted to fit those goals and abilities. A game uses all these elements to sculpt a form of activity. And when we play games, we take on an alternate form of agency. We take on new goals and accept different sets of abilities. We give ourselves over to different and focused... We give ourselves over to different and focused... It's supposed to be to a different and focused way of... Did you forget the A there? Am I stupid? Why are there dashed lines there? Derek, what the fuck? We give ourselves over to a different and focused way of inhabiting our own agency. Goals, ability, and environment. These are the means by which the game designer practices their art, and flexing our own agency to fit. That is how we experience the game designer's art. Games, then, are a unique social technology. They are a method for inscribing forms of agency into artificial vessels, for recording them, preserving them, and passing them around. And we possess a special ability. We can be fluid with our agency, and submerge ourselves in alternate agencies designed by another. In other words, we can use games as to communicate forms of agency. Games are a part of our human practices of inscription. Painting lets us record sights. Music lets us record sounds. Story lets us record narrative. And games let us record agencies. There's a lot of talk on agency. There's a running theme of agency here. This is a fucking English essay. What is this shit? That can be useful as part of our development. Just as novels let us experience lives we have not lived, games let us experience forms of agency we might not have discovered on our own. But those shaped experiences of agency can be valuable in themselves as art. In games, values are usually singular and shared. In games, each person is a simplified agent. And in most cases, competing agents are pursuing the same goal. When we are playing tennis, I do not have to cope with subtle differences between your and my view of the good. You and I are after exactly the same thing: points and victory. It is not that we are cooperating exactly, but we are motivationally coherent to one another. In some sense, the motivational world described by traditional economics, one in which identically motivated rational actors compete with one another, is false of the actual world, but true of game worlds. When games work, they can sometimes present us with the world as we wish it would have been. The worlds of games are harmonious and interesting worlds, where even our worst impulses are transformed into the pleasure of others. In ordinary life, we must build practical activities and relationships from gears that were never made to fit. But in games, we can machine all the gears to fit from the start. Games can communicate modes of agency, and when we play games, we can learn new modes of agency. Games can constitute a library of agencies, and we use that library to grow. Fuck you for making me do this.
This is how T. Nguyen defines games in his book, Games Agency is Art. Games are made up of arbitrary goals and restrictions that allow us to take on different forms of agency. Okay, so if you're someone who's read the first chapter of Nguyen's book, you may be confused by me calling the goals and restrictions of a game arbitrary. As you can see here, he literally stated the exact opposite of what I did about games being made up of arbitrary goals, stating that they are not arbitrary in the slightest. This definitely seems like a contradiction. However, I believe there's a difference in how he and I are defining arbitrary in relation to the goals of a game. Now, we are both using it in the same way in the sense of defining something as lacking intrinsic value and depth alongside a lack of a concrete logical reason for its existence as is. However, it is the context in which we apply these terms that the differences arise. In Nguyen's book, he refers to a game's goals as not being arbitrary in the context of responding to the accusation that spending time playing games is meaningless, that achieving the goals of games is arbitrary in the face of goals that produce tangibly positive outcomes in the real world. He refutes this by stating that they are only arbitrary from the wrong perspective, stating that when viewed from the perspective of motivational inversion, people experience agencies that they wouldn't have otherwise, and these experiences are just as artistically valuable as any other artistic mediums, and he wants to bring forward games' artistic value to people. If you need proof, please refer back to the quote from Nguyen's book that I stated earlier. Now, when I say the goals of a game are arbitrary, I am not refuting the idea stated by Nguyen. Rather, I am saying they are arbitrary in a consequential sense. What I mean is that the gamification of real-world movements and activities is damaging to both of those things, but gamification is relatively harmless as a part of play. But, given the non-serious nature of play, given that modifying the agency one partakes in a game is often considered unimportant as it exists for the sake of the individual's fun, this means that the goals and obstacles are equally non-serious and thus are arbitrary in the sense that they lack an intrinsic and rational reason to be in place, such as potentially damaging a serious social movement, and thus they are easily malleable. Basically, I am calling the goals of a game arbitrary to mean that said goals exist in a context that makes them easily malleable, and not that said goals don't have any artistic value or don't say and teach us anything about ourselves. With this in mind, I would say that the game I played with the remote control log glitch invested me in a certain agency that I enjoyed. There is an important question to be asked here, however. In the book, it is mentioned that the game designers are the ones who create the goals, rules, abilities, and thus agency the player invests themselves in. So, would using glitch mechanics like these alongside others I mentioned, such as parallel universes in Mario 64, are these glitch mechanics part of the game Dinosaur Planet itself as designed by Rare? Or is what I'm doing here just creating a new game for myself using the pre-existing game and outside information as fundamentals to build it? Am I just making an elaborate Dinosaur Planet game fanfiction thing out of the raw dump of this prototype? Not to mention, who takes the credit for designing this game? And if I put the work into designing it to my sensibilities, is it even good? And you may be wondering, why am I talking about this and not where I stand in terms of striving play and achievement play and what those actually mean and so on? Well, that will be addressed later, and the topic I'm going on about currently ties into the point I made near the end of part 2 before the whole mental breakdown bit. What I'm talking about here ties into the idea of a wholly different art experience that includes and expands beyond the confines of the original game itself. Like, what does that really entail when you get down into the weeds of this idea? Well, for me, whether or not it's good from a game design perspective, the raw dump on its own as a game is a no. Like I said earlier, I installed the Dino mod because I'm doing this shit on easy mode, which actually brings up an interesting point about the struggling aspect of striving play, specifically how J.S. Russell confronts this point in their article, Striving Play and Achievement Play in Games, Agency is Art.
Your sacred motion, your sound, it takes me higher. Just love in motion, no fear, takes me higher.
Struggle is commonly associated with striving. The two are often found together and can be sought in games and present opportunities for achievement and spectacle. But struggle is not a necessary, or I suspect, even a sufficient part of striving or of striving play. A discussion that shows this will raise doubts about whether struggle is what is chosen for its own sake in striving play. I argue that it is rather the activity of striving that is chosen for its own sake, which does not necessarily presuppose struggle. I have previously argued that what is distinctive about striving is that it can be done for the intrinsic value of engagement with certain challenges. In particular, challenges that exercise various distinctive human intellectual, emotional, or physical capacities. A few years ago, to celebrate my 60th birthday, my son, Keith, who's a proficient mountain climber, took me on a hike to one of the peaks in the Canadian Rockies. We trekked up to a long ramp that led to the summit, but saw another lower ramp beside it that looked more aesthetically interesting and, for me, easier because of a less steep ascent to the peak. When we walked around too and began the ascent up the lower ramp, we were soon able to see that it would not take us to the summit. We had a choice. We could retrace our steps to the ascent route we had left, or we could climb a rock face where we were standing that connected the two ramps. Retracing our path was not a preferred option. It would add a lot of time to our hike, and it would be boring if we decided to climb the rock face connecting the ramps. It was an exhilarating experience for the both of us. We had to find the path together. It involved much joint deliberation and choice, two of the things I love about outdoor climbing and wilderness hiking. It also tested us physically. I was now also exhilarated because I had done something I did not think I could or even wanted to do, and I had proved to myself I could do it without struggle. The story was instructive. I had no experience of struggling up the rock face. It was not easy. There was significant mental and physical effort involved, and obstacles, and challenges, but not struggle. I was aware that I could fall and seriously hurt myself, or worse. Each step was taken with patient choice and control within the limits of my ability and physical capacity at that moment. I kept up with my many years younger son and felt an equal partner in solving the problem with a rock face. Together we made consistent progress all the way to the top. At no point did I experience what could be described as struggle. Indeed, if I had struggled, the experience would have been harrowing, and not at all the sort of challenge I was looking for.
The distinction between struggling and striving is that striving is specifically placed within your abilities, not necessarily to the point of always being easy, but not impossibly difficult either. The point is to have a challenge to various faculties, not one that is harrowing, but rather one that creates the most rewarding aesthetic experience possible, whatever that manifests as, through engaging with the challenge. Struggling entails pushing whatever abilities are being challenged to and beyond their absolute limits, which can be a part of striving play, but not always. Trying to figure out how to get into the cave without knowing the log glitch would have been a nightmarish struggle that I wouldn't have enjoyed in the slightest. Also, a tidbit from J.S. Russell's article that will be important to this essay going forward is the way in which he defines striving. I have previously argued that what is distinctive about striving is that it can be done for the intrinsic value of engagement with certain challenges. In particular, challenges that exercise various distinctive human intellectual, emotional, or physical capacities. This is important as it indicates that the means can expand beyond that of a mere performance of an activity. The means can also involve an emotional aspect to its challenges. A why. Why are we doing this? Why are we invested? What is the emotional journey we have invested ourselves in that we will directly involve ourselves in with our agency? Performing the means isn't limited to just beating a near impossible challenge to engage in the means of overcoming it. It can also be, say, saving someone you've become attached to over the course of the game and engaging in the cathartic emotional journey of desperation and facing the challenge to the cathartic relief in overcoming it, with the physical and intellectual challenge catered to heightening the overall resulting aesthetic experience rather than producing the maximum amount of struggle. The emotions stemming from desperation can come from the mere engagement in these intellectual and physical challenges on their own. I'm sure we've all gotten unreasonably emotionally invested in the game of Pong at some point. Overall, though, the emotions brought about over the journey are part of the challenges provided by a game alongside its physical and intellectual challenges. A game can more specifically target and create unique emotional challenges as well. It can give you agency in a situation that produces many challenging, volatile emotions that you need to push yourself through to perform the physical and intellectual means the best, producing an emotional striving while not being so volatile as to produce a likely off-putting emotional struggle. An example of a game that creates volatile emotional challenges you need to push yourself through is Eternal Darkness on the GameCube with its sanity effects system. The people over in the Dinosaur Planet Discord server have done amazing work in restoring this game into a playable state, reactivating dormant stuff within the game, fixing game-breaking bugs and crashes, and allowing the game to attempt to be the immersive experience along the lines of what Rare intended. At least at that point in development, given, a work of art is never finished, only abandoned, and all of that stuff. I would say that I chose the Dynomod version, or at least an earlier version of the Dynomod, such as version 2.4, given how complete the later ones are, at first, as that helps to balance out things to where it creates the ideal emotional and intellectual challenges and experiences I wish to engage in for the earlier parts of the game. Kinda retroactively though, because you see I also chose it because I wasn't aware of the later Dynomod versions when I was starting out, but yeah, it still effectively worked out this way at the end of the day. There is seemingly one major hiccup with my interpretation of J.S. Russell's perspective, and it is relevant to the rest of this essay as well, and that is the type of game that Nguyen's analysis centers around. Said type of games are Suitsian games. In chapter 1 of his book, Nguyen describes Suitsian games as an abridgment of games as Brandon Suits analyzes and defines them. Brandon Suits defines playing games as the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles, as he puts it in short. In other words, a game is a structure with an arbitrary goal or set of goals alongside arbitrary obstacles and restrictions that are chosen to be abided by for the sake of engaging in a certain form of agency. Achieving the goals of a game, according to Brandon, is the attempt to develop the skills necessitated by the obstacles and restrictions in order to overcome them and reach the goal. I don't go to the basketball court late at night with a ladder and spend hours passing the ball through the hoop. Now, the purpose, or reason, behind why someone may play one of these games can vary, but it can be separate from the game's goals, with the goal being a game's win state, with the purpose either aligning with the goal, or being completely different, with some examples of purposes for playing a game being just having fun or developing one's skills at the game, or overcoming hardship for the sake of it, or for fame and status. And to achieve these purposes to either, depending on the specific purpose, win or try to win in order to fully engage in the agency the Suitsian game provides. This is all said and good, but the issue comes around the bounds as to what can be considered a Suitsian game. Suits took himself to be offering a complete account of games and game playing. For this, he has been roundly criticized. There are, as many have pointed out, aspects of game playing that do not conform to Suits' theory. Not every game involves the process of striving towards overcoming obstacles to achieve a goal, such as a relaxing walking simulator game. There are also games that, while they may still have obstacles to strive against and overcome to reach a goal, they heavily downplay those aspects to orient themselves around their narratives, such as Night in the Woods, or as Nguyen himself gives as an example, the Stanley Parable. Or, you could say that the strictest rendition of what is a Suitsian game would better fit a game like a Mega Man 3 rather than the more narratively oriented Dinosaur Planet. I say strictest rendition because there is debate as to where the bounds as to what is considered a Suitsian game actually lies, which Nguyen acknowledges in his book. Some people believe that all games are technically Suitsian games, while others believe that it is only one of the many types of games, with both perspectives here being absolutely reliant on the wavering idea of what a game even is, if it's even properly definable at all. There is an argument to be made that in said relaxing walking simulator game I mentioned earlier, walking is the means to overcome the obstacle of navigating from one location to another in order to reach the goal of making it to the other location. Nguyen addresses this by choosing to define game for the purposes of his book in reference to Suits' idea of a game, with it always including the practical struggle to overcome obstacles to achieve seemingly arbitrary goals, using arbitrary here as Nguyen defines it. Now, as I noted earlier, Dinosaur Planet is a more narratively oriented game. It is far more focused on immersing the player in this fantastical dinosaur world, letting said player take on the agency of exploring this planet with Crystal and Saber, than it is focused on the obstacles to reach the goals the game sets for you to achieve. There is focus put on striving to perform the means to overcome the obstacles, but it is ultimately downplayed in comparison to its goals of immersing you in its world and narrative. The game certainly makes one feel a lot of emotions. It certainly made me feel a lot of emotions. If it didn't, I would be making these godforsaken videos. But many of the emotions the game evokes are ones like wonder and joy at the beautiful world and various empathetic emotions towards the character's situations. However, it's highly debatable, leaning towards unlikely, that these emotions constitute a challenge. Even my experience with this game game as a prototype is more narratively oriented in a sense. Sure, my example of the remote control log glitch section on its own would most certainly count as a suit scene game in the strictest sense, but, as I will get into more later, the log glitch section represents the agency I take on in the Dinosaur Planet Raw prototype, and the focus on overcoming obstacles is given more focus than in the intended Dinosaur Planet experience, yet it is also ultimately downplayed in comparison to its emotionally and narratively oriented goals. It's something that partially includes the intended obstacles, narrative, and emotional components, and adds a whole new layer of obstacles, narrative, and emotional components on top of it. And for me, the emotional and narrative components are still the ones the game is oriented around the most. Its true goal is to allow myself the agency to roleplay in the narrative that I more or less laid out in part 2, and the overcoming of any challenges comes secondary to that. After all, I chose to play the Dynamod version of this game rather than the one that would produce the greatest struggle. So with this in mind, what does this mean for my analysis of Dinosaur Planet in any form? Well, speaking of not going for the greatest struggle, I'm instead going to once again refer to J.S. Russell's admittedly abridged definition of striving. I noted earlier there was a hiccup with his perspective, and that is how it relates to the strictest definition of Suitsian games. That is that Suitsian games are solely about the struggle to overcome arbitrary obstacles, and that downplaying that struggle into just striving makes these games less of a true Suitsian game. Or at least that's how it seems at first. J.S. Russell addresses this issue in his paper as well.
Perhaps it is tempting to say that struggle is sufficient for striving play in Suitsian games. While this is often true, it doesn't seem quite right either. In the rock climbing example just discussed, if I had begun to struggle with the climb, I would have quit and retraced my steps if that were an option. I don't quite want to test my limits in this way. Indeed, when I'm scrambling on dangerous terrain, I have in the back of my mind that if it becomes a struggle, I'll stop. I plan my route so that if I do struggle, I can make it down easily enough that I can leave the struggle behind. Struggle sometimes signals the end of striving play in Suitsian games, and not just for not-so-bold rock climbers. Consider the long-running BBC game show Just a Minute, where the object is to speak extemporaneously, fluently, and entertainingly for a minute without hesitation, repetition, or deviation on a surprise and typically obscure topic. In effect, if you struggle, the game is over. The point of the game is to strive, not to struggle. You play for the fun of the challenge, which is to eschew struggle while taking on the adversity of giving an unprepared talk on a topic you likely know nothing about. There is a parallel with my rock climbing exploit. I took on a challenge for fun, eschewing struggle, even though it arose from the adversity of making a wrong choice about a route to a mountain peak.
Here's the thing, I actually find J.S. Russell's assessment of this point to be incomplete. I say this not to mean that he didn't argue the point he was trying to make in the quote well, I believe he did just fine in that regard. Rather, for the point I'm trying to make, I think it's incomplete. I don't know if he'd agree or disagree with this upcoming assessment, but here are my thoughts nevertheless. For the rock climbing example, the reason that struggling would be bad in this game is that failing this game, which would be falling, would obviously have some serious life-threatening consequences, and thus the notion of failure here would be harrowing. This is something that his second example, the BBC radio game show Just a Minute, would address given the significantly lower stakes associated with failing. However, I find this example to be incomplete as well. Specifically, the fact that in this game, struggling is the fail state. And because of this fact, I feel that this example obfuscates the relationship between striving and struggling in intense competitive games like this. While this example does work to showcase the value of striving and striving play, it downplays the importance of struggling. I believe a more apt example to illustrate this relationship would be Super Smash Bros. Pick any example from the series, the particular Smash game doesn't really matter here. Super Smash Bros. Is a fighting game where you beat the shit out of each other to raise each other's percentages. With the higher the percentage, the further you fly with each hit, with the goal being to knock the opponent off the stage either a set number of times first or the most times in a set time limit. You can also do some other fucky shit in these games, but it's really not important right now. Like with any fighting game, there are fighting strategies and styles one can develop for optimal performance of the means, taking on the challenge of developing and maintaining skilled play over the course of the match, either matching an equally optimal player or winning due to their struggle to perform optimally would be striving in this case. Likewise, choking, as us gamers put it, or losing that harmonious flow of the performance of the means, whether it comes from your opponent pulling out an unexpected play against you, or simple human error caused by nerves, would be struggling in this case. The difference between Super Smash Bros. And the examples J.S. Russell illustrates is that struggling in a Smash game is neither life-threatening, nor is it automatically the fail state. While you may choke during a game, it isn't impossible to reorient yourself and return to a state of striving. While constantly striving and having a harmonious flow in your performance of the means can be gratifying, gratifying for sure. After all, I think most people enjoy winning against a challenging opponent through constant perfect performance over their opponent's slightly flawed performance. I do also want to make the case though that a game of Smash where one does falter, where one struggles at various points throughout the match, but still ultimately manages to strive enough to eke out a victory, is far more gratifying than just striving. Striving on its own can be aesthetically harmonious, as Russell puts it. However, constant striving, I feel, can become hollow and stale. Even if there is a challenge, if there isn't enough of a challenge to where loss can be very blatantly threatened, then winning itself diminishes in impact in a positive correlation to the diminished threat of loss. Also, constant striving can become boring as well. For those whose purpose in playing a game is to perform the means perfectly, how long is achieving that purpose going to be gratifying if it isn't challenging enough to not be constant? Even Ewan himself acknowledges something like this in his book. Okay, but before I show the quote, let's take this moment for some appreciation. Oh! 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 Oh!
About time someone kicked you to the curb. Can't let him three-stock me in pit. Is this Minty's true form?
Oh!
That was the coolest of my entire Smash career. And
Oh my god! That was amazing!
Oh, second. I remember the Kamehameha.
My spouse and I once took up racquetball in order to keep fit in a moderately entertaining way. When we play racquetball, I try to win with all my might. And my trying to win, my actually caring about winning during the course of the game, is quite useful. Wanting to win helps my fitness by getting me to try harder during the game. It also helps the process be engaging and compelling. In order to obtain those benefits, I need to induce in myself an interest in winning. But that interest is only temporary and disconnected from my larger and more enduring ends. You can see how disconnected and short-term that interest is by looking at how I strategically manipulate my ability to win in the long term. Suppose someone offered me free racquetball lessons. These lessons would cause me to jump far ahead of my spouse in skill. If I was an achievement player, I should certainly take them. But, as a matter of fact, I wouldn't actually take those lessons. If either my spouse or myself pulled substantially ahead of the other in skill, the game would turn quite unpleasant for the both of us. Our matches would lose their interest and spark. We'd probably end up giving up racquetball altogether. In other words, in my long-term life, I make strategic decisions that keep my skill in check and prevent me from winning too many games. I manipulate my capacity to win, with an eye towards maintaining a desirable sort of struggle. But during the game itself, I play all out to win. If my decision to forego those lessons is comprehensible, then striving play is a real motivational possibility.
Too much striving can become stale and hollow, and too much struggling, as J.S. Russell makes clear in his paper, can become harrowing, or at the very least, I feel, it can become unpleasant. Therefore, with occasional examples such as rock climbing with standing, I believe that for striving players, a Suitsian game that is peak and goated, as the kids nowadays put it, is one where you may not necessarily win, but it is one in which there is an ebb and flow between striving and struggling over the course of the game's runtime. Bits of struggling can make games more dynamic and reinvigorate players to attempt to achieve a harmonious performance of the means by stripping them of it just long enough for them to strongly desire it again. Though it is important to note that this isn't a set-in-stone rule. Every player is different, and thus they'll have different preferences for struggling and striving. It's better to think of this struggling-striving dichotomy as more of a spectrum, with pure striving on one end and pure struggling on the other end, with someone leaning left wanting more striving than struggling in their overall ebb and flow, and someone leaning right desiring something a little more vice versa. And of course, where someone is at on the spectrum isn't entirely stable, but rather it will shift based on a variety of factors like their mood at the time of playing the game, what their purpose for playing the game is, and what game in particular they are playing. For me personally, more often than not, I prefer games where I'll struggle more than I strive. I have a pretty good tolerance for and masochistic enjoyment of constantly throwing myself at a challenge where I have to perform a near perfect sequence of actions in order to succeed. Although, as made clear earlier with the whole me using the Dynamod thing, I do have my limits. Now, this is all said and good, but there still is the other question of what this means for my analysis of Dinosaur Planet in any form. Dinosaur Planet is still a narratively oriented game, and it doesn't conform to the strictest definition of a Suitsian game either. However, as was made clear earlier, the strictest definition isn't the only definition. Even though the immersion in the game's world and story are at the forefront of the experience, the process of overcoming unnecessary obstacles to achieve a goal is still a large part of this game's experience. Therefore, it can still be considered a Suitsian game. However, it is far from the purest example of this type of game, and that still heavily impacts the art experience this game provides. In his book, Nguyen describes both the concept of aesthetic striving games and aesthetic striving play. Aesthetic striving games are games designed primarily for the purpose of providing aesthetic experiences of practicality to their players. In other words, these are games where winning at them is less the point than trying to win at them, to allow striving players to achieve the purpose of performing the means by providing obstacles that provide a fully explored performance of said means. What Nguyen means by aesthetic experiences of practicality is tied into the concept of aesthetic striving play, which is gameplay engaged in for the sake of the aesthetic quality of the struggle. Of course, for our purposes, we'll be substituting Nguyen's conception of struggle, at least as far as I understand it admittedly, with the struggling to striving spectrum that I laid out earlier. Anyway, these aesthetic qualities of striving to struggling are, for one, the notion of harmony that I mentioned before. Harmony in this case being akin to having a moment or decent bit of time of pure, unadulterated, god-tier gameplay that perfectly overcomes the genuinely challenging obstacles with peak finesse. Practicality is another of these aesthetic qualities, and it refers to the beauty of actions based on what they end up achieving, the beauty of making decisions, acting, and solving problems, rather than the aesthetic quality of gracefulness, which is the aesthetic beauty stemming from how the action itself was performed, such as performing the most beautiful dance you've ever seen that just smashes the competition. From what I understand, the aesthetic experience of practicality is that curious and exciting, "oh, I can do this" feeling. Harmony is also referred to as harmonious flow throughout the essay, I believe due to one of the essays I read using it in that way, and that's just how it latched on in my brain. Anyway, the important thing here, and why I interrupted everything, is that looking back at how harmony is defined in Nguyen's book, as shown on screen here, is that I realized that I did a big, huge fucky-uppy. In his book, there are a couple variants to how harmony is defined. Firstly, we have this definition. When a chess player discovers a move that elegantly escapes a trap, the harmony of the move, the lovely fit between the challenge and the solution, is available both to themselves and to outsiders. Now, a move that elegantly escapes a trap bit seems to be what I latched onto initially, hence the definition of harmony that I came up with in the video. But it is this notion of the fit between solution and challenge that breaks harmony away from being diet gracefulness. Rather, from what I understand, it seems to be a combination of practicality and gracefulness. Practicality is the aesthetic experience of finding solutions to problems, and thus harmony is the most heightened form of these. It is the perfect solution to the perfect problem. A moment where the puzzle pieces precisely placed together. A moment where, as is described in the book, a beautiful moment of epiphany where finding the perfect argument for a point one's trying to make is found. And that this is a paradigmatic aesthetic experience of playing games, as games are designed to induce this harmony, whereas only glimpses of it can be experienced in real life. In ordinary practical life, we catch momentary glimpses, when we are lucky, of harmony between our abilities and our tasks. But often, there is no such harmony. Our abilities fall far short of the tasks, or the tasks are horribly dull, but we must put nose to the grindstone and grade these papers anyway. Really, harmony does seem similar to how I described the "oh, I can do this" feeling I associated with the aesthetic experience of practicality. It may be another fuck-up conflation on my end, but yeah. Anyway, this notion of harmony is emphasized further in the second variant of how it's defined, but something more is available especially to the player, a special experience of harmony between their abilities and the challenges of the world. When your abilities are pushed to their maximum, when your mind or body is just barely able to do what's required, when your abilities are just barely enough to cope with the situation at hand. That is an experience of harmony available primarily to the player themselves. It is a harmony between self and challenge, between between the practical self and the obstacles of its world. It is a harmony of practical fit between your whole self and the world. The first variant seems to be an external experiencing of harmony, of witnessing harmonious performance of an action, hits my comparison to my definition of gracefulness, which I believe manages to align with the Newton's definition fairly accurately. And the second variant is the internal, the euphoric feelings one gets when they come upon the perfect solution to the perfect challenge, hence practicality. His talk of abilities being pushed to the maximum is obviously in reference to struggle as a necessary component of creating harmony. Now, when substituting that with the struggling to striving spectrum came up with earlier, the resulting monitoring and measured curation of a game's challenges in accordance to one's abilities, the curation of a game's difficulty curve, sounds very similar to the core game design concept of flow, which I'll get into more depth about much later, but in short, is the idea of balancing a game's difficulty, among other necessary components, in a way that gets a player in the zone. It's when the player gets completely sucked into the game and into overcoming the challenge to reach the goal. In a way, it's the perfect meeting of a player's abilities and the challenges they face. In a sense, this can be an apt descriptor for the aesthetic experience of harmony Newen discusses, which makes my botched definition of harmonious flow and my later correct definition of game flow all the more confusing, as they should, in a sense, be the same, but because of my botched definition, they mean two completely different things. I say in a sense here because this reading relies on my adjusting of Newen's struggle point to my struggling to striving spectrum point. As for my botched definition of harmony and how I'm going to address it going forward, well, my botched definition, as I indicated earlier, is basically just gracefulness but with some added specificities. Specifically, the points that harmonious flow is 1, more intense than the aesthetic experience of gracefulness, and 2, it only occurs in short bursts over a small period of time, unlike gracefulness, which can happen for a much longer period of time. Obviously, this was me recognizing their similarity while not recognizing my inaccuracy, and thus reading really deeply into my own definitions of both of these concepts, trying to find the minute differences between the two, rather than checking if I was correct in the first place. This is easily the biggest and most embarrassing mistake in the entire essay, and going forward, starting after this chapter, because I've already recorded all the lines for this chapter, I'm not going to record them again because yeah. I'll do my best to scrub my use of harmony and harmonious flow from the essay, but for the record, wherever it may crop up, whenever it is me using the term in my writing, harmony and harmonious flow effectively mean the same thing as gracefulness. So now with that out of the way, let's get back to the usual proceedings. I bring this up because the Dinosaur Planet prototype is an aesthetic striving game in my opinion. The technical issues often create roadblocks in continuing onward in the game, creating sudden obstacles to overcome in order to reach the goal of re-immersing yourself in the game's world to try to achieve the game's intended goals for its intended narrative reasons. This leads to performing the means of poking around the shambles of what should be functioning in order to push through it, creating the aesthetic experience of practicality. Although, it also creates these sort of aesthetic experiences of disharmony and a lack of gracefulness given the technical issue's sudden and janky nature, but I find these aesthetic experiences befitting that of a prototype, and there can be moments of harmony and gracefulness during these moments of disharmony and a lack of gracefulness as you manage to perfectly navigate the shambles right back into getting the game back to a stable state. It's just that one is far more prevalent than the other. A perfect example showcasing these aesthetic experiences is parts 3 and 3.5 of the playthrough, specifically how Discovery falls massively glitched out, and thus my resulting attempts to problem solve and overcome the shambles of this area to get through it legitimately. If I were an achievement player, I would have just clipped right through the door. Now, there are a couple of things to note here. First, unlike more intentionally designed games, this isn't a perfect crystallization of these aesthetic experiences. For one, note how I felt the raw prototype created far too much of an impossible struggle, more resembling the random chaos of our everyday reality as Newen describes it, rather than creating a rewarding aesthetic experience. The Dynamod 2.4 version is far more tame and balanced, although I do feel that while the experience is overall great, it could be better if it were more acutely and intentionally designed. Also, there's the seeming issue that overcoming many of these technical issues are still practically impossible in the Dynamod 2.4 version. However, winning being impossible doesn't mean that it is impossible to still strive at performing the means. This perspective is okay, given that Newen speaks of a game that embodies this perspective in his book called Sign. He describes this game as one where everyone needs to roleplay. They just need to do it. He describes this game as one where everyone who wants to roleplay creates an inner truth that their character desperately needs to get out. The obstacles to this goal are that your character is mute and they cannot use a pre-existing sign language.
The game is played in total silence. The only way to communicate is through a new sign language, which the players must invent during the game. There are 3 rounds. In every round, each player invents a single sign and teaches it to the other players. Then all players attempt to have a free-form conversation. Communication happens painfully and slowly, the occasional rare and luminous breakthrough. And every time you feel that you are misunderstood or do not understand somebody else, you must take a marker and make a compromise mark on your hand.
There's also the addition of his own house rule, which states that the player's own inner truths and what they thought each other's inner truths were not to be stated to each other ever. He states that the reason for this is that it is in spirit with the purpose of the game and only serves to add to its strange potency. This purpose, of course, is to struggle at performing the means of communicating under these particular restrictions. To engage in the particular agency of only being able to communicate by inventing a new language on the fly. This game, under our framework, mostly facilitates an intense struggle to communicate with glorious moments of striving when a harmonious flow of communication is achieved. Striving is possible without winning because there is the possibility of descending back into struggling before the goal is achieved. The house rule highlights the fact that this is an aesthetic striving game because the purpose the game exists to serve isn't the experience of winning, which unlike with the actual purpose, this experience would appeal to achievement players, and instead the game's actual purpose it serves is to facilitate maximum engrossment in exploring and performing the means to try to achieve the game's goal. The player's larger purpose is to experience the precise texture of struggling, failing, and barely managing to communicate, as Ewan puts it. Likewise, in Dinosaur Planet, the purpose the prototype as the game serves is not to win at overcoming the technical issues, but to experience the precise texture of struggling and striving in the attempt at overcoming them. There is one more thing I want to note about Dinosaur Planet not being a perfect crystallization of the aesthetic experiences it provides before I move on. While this is certainly true, we have to remember that this is true in terms of Dinosaur Planet as a Suitsian game in the strictest sense. Let's look back one more time at J.S. Russell's definition of striving, specifically the part about emotional challenges. I discussed earlier what I believe this entails in terms of the means that are being performed in a game, and while I believe that ultimately these emotional challenges largely refer to the emotional struggle and striving that is born from the attempts to overcome the obstacles to reach a game's goal, for example, you have to take on the emotional challenge to assuage the feelings of panic and frustration in order to play well during an intense game of Smash. And while I believe that this is largely the point, it isn't the whole point. As I also made clear earlier, I believe that a game's narrative elements can also play into the emotional challenges it provides. Part of the game's sign seemingly involves being temporarily emotionally invested in your own and others' inner truths in order to fully immerse yourselves in precise texture of the struggling and striving. Because why try so hard without buying into the fabricated emotional stakes of the narrative of an inner truth that just has to get out but desperately struggles to do so? But how exactly does Dinosaur Planet and its prototype manifest emotional challenges, if at all? Well, there's the typical video gamey way it manifests emotional challenges. It's normal to get that invested in Pog, I swear! And of course, this game has a really cool story, world, and characters, and you can argue that some light emotional stakes result from that. However, saying that I was fully invested in those things would be a complete misnomer. For one, there's the prototype side of things breaking immersion in these cool aspects, and as I'll get into more later, the prototype brings its own set of cool things, but like with the intended experience, it's at best light emotional stakes that I struggle to really see as an emotional challenge. And, on top of that, I was hanging out with my friends while playing most of this, meaning that my investment was split with being dipshits and doing dipshit things in the game with them. So, maybe in this sense these evoked emotions don't provide much, if any, challenge, and thus it'd be difficult to consider them part of the striving and struggling aspect of this game. But these parts are still very clearly important. The investment still does color the why in the sense of emotional investment in the game's narrative, and thus the performance of the means somewhat, for like whatever bit it can, showcasing that there still is at least a tiny bit of connection here. And beyond that, the emotions this game and its prototypes evoke are still integral to it as an art experience overall. So what gives? As I stated earlier, Dinosaur Planet in all the forms it manifests in is a narratively oriented game. This means that so much of the overall overall art experience of Dinosaur Planet involves the emotions the game's world and narrative places on the player. And, while on its own, the prototype doesn't act as a perfect crystallization of the aesthetic experiences of practicality, and if it were judged solely on that basis, well, I'll get more into my precise thoughts on the game's design later, but it's important to note that this aesthetic experience isn't the full story. The game's other aesthetic components, such as the music, graphics, narrative, and so on, exist in a synergistic relationship with its other aesthetic components born from the fact that it's a game. These other aesthetic components being ones we'll get into more in part 4 of this video essay. But for the time being, the point to be made is that while this game isn't the perfect crystallization of certain aesthetic experiences, it has other components that create an overall unique draw to this game that helps to negate the harm of the flaws of the other parts. Just like I said in part 2 of this video essay, there's just such a strong appeal to these elements of the game that the people who initially discovered the prototype stuck with it despite its resemblance to an obtuse puzzle box. But this isn't the full story. There's still the questions I asked earlier of who gets the credit for all of this, and by extension, is this praise really deserved? Especially considering that the ability to strive in this game requires the use of outside resources such as the Dinosaur Planet Wiki. We know the framework of striving and struggling in the aesthetic experience of practicality, but with these stickler issues, how much of a good crystallization, if it's even good at all, is the Dinosaur Planet prototype really?